Now that I could move on and face farther academic challenges that awaited at GFS, there was one more obstacle that needed to be dealt with. I needed to overcome all fear and self-doubt. Despite reassurances from various adults, I still wasn't comfortable with the idea of sign language interpreter in class. Luckily for me, I got a brief reprieve. An interpreter was not immediately available when the ninth grade began. A red tape snafu had bought me some extra time. It gave me time to assess the situation, the people around me, and how we would all respond to this person who would follow me around like a parole officer. It gave me more time to struggle with my deaf identity in my own solitary world. And struggle with my identity I did, in strange ways indeed. I immediately found out that the required ninth grade music class was not going to be a piece of cake. Previously, from third grade at Plymouth, meeting up with eighth grade at GFS, I could barely get by in choir. I had enough residual hearing so that with a music sheet I could learn the words to most songs. My sensorineural hearing loss was such that everyone's voice was garbled to me, but with the lyrics in my hand, I knew in advance what everyone was singing. Usually I could follow the music well enough to memorize the words, and then I would dazzle everyone in the audience with my deep baritone as I belted out one tune after another. And oh, come on, you didn't believe that, did you? Of course, I lip synced. I faked my way through choir for years. As crazy as it seems, sometimes it was fun. At PMFS, I actually looked forward to the special events where we performed for our parents and friends. The ninth grade was a different story. This was the big leagues. Instead of one of the small class sections singing together, the ninth grade choir was the entire class, all 104 of us. To make matters worse, the teachers split us up into different sections: tenor, bass, soprano, and terrified deaf kid. There was no way I could keep up with this. After attending 3 classes, I gave up. From there on, I cut weekly choir class, choosing instead to hide in some remote spot in the library. I would spend that time catching up on my homework, all the while hoping I wouldn't get into trouble for cutting choir. When the ninth grade gave a performance during an assembly, I sheepishly sat with the 8th graders and hoping no one would notice. Again, we have similar issue reappearing here. Why didn't I speak up? I could have and should have told them that it was crazy to put a deaf guy in choir class. Who would dispute that? What were they going to do? Put me in front and make me do an ear-splitting solo rendition of Ain't No Mountain High Enough? Of course not. But I was convinced that because I was isolated in a hearing world, I had to play by the hearing rules. I never complained. Finally, a couple of months into ninth grade, the charade would end. I was informed that an interpreter would be soon joining me in class. That was it. All fingers would be pointed in my direction. See that guy? He's deaf. They were all going to make fun of me, and I cringed just thinking about it. Remember how I was ashamed of my hearing aid in grade school? At least I could conceal that little contraption behind my ear. Where was I going to stash an interpreter? The weekend before my interpreter's debut, I decided to do some soul searching and wound up reading the entire school directory. I sifted through all of the names so that I could assess who would be most likely to ridicule me. From there, I would figure out a way to deal with whatever humiliation they would heap on my fragile deaf psyche. I shuffled through the pages with trepidation. Allen, nah. Brown, nah. A few minutes later, it was Zimmerman, nah, and suddenly it dawned on me. Because of the communication barriers, I wasn't really close to any of my classmates. But no one out there was making my life miserable either. They were pretty much leaving me alone. It was not them, the other students, but I alone who needed to come to terms with my deaf identity. I realized that I was being way too self-conscious. It was time to give my classmates a chance to see who I really was. And most important of all, it was time to give myself a chance to be deaf, not some hearing wannabe. The following Monday, I was in my usual fog in history class. A stimulating classroom discussion was underway, but I was sitting in the corner biting my nails and drawing doodles on my notebook to give the teacher a sense that I was hanging in there best that I could. I would occasionally look at whoever was talking. It might have looked like I was following the conversation, but in reality, I was in my own world. 2 outs, bases loaded, bottom of the ninth, 7th game of the World Series. It doesn't get any better than this. Up to the plate starts Mark Drosbach, the last hope for his Philadelphia Phillies. And here's the pitch. My daydream was suddenly interrupted by the class advisor, who entered the classroom with another adult. He discreetly pointed in my direction, and all of a sudden, the woman pulled up a chair and sat close to me. Very close. She was right in my face, slowly enunciating with her lips every word of the classroom discussion. I could smell the tuna sandwich she had for lunch. I was utterly confused. Where was the sign language? They hired some idiot who slowly repeated everything with exaggerated lip movements? To make matters worse, she leaned close to me, that we looked like two lovesick teenagers sharing a sundae in the '50s malt shop. My face reddened with embarrassment, as I put up with this cheap imitation of an interpreter for another half hour. I could feel the rest of the class sneaking glances at us. They were clearly wondering what the hell I was doing, and so was I. Mercifully, the class came to an end, and my interpreter was formally able to introduce herself. Hi, I'm Emily. Sorry I was late, but I had a meeting with your advisor for a while. I will be working with you from now on. She was really nice, but... Hi, I said somewhat hesitantly, and then I began to sign slowly. Nice to meet you. Emily's eyes widened in astonishment. Signing fluently, she asked, You sign? Oh my God, no one told me. This is unbelievable. She dropped her head on the desk and started laughing. Looking up, she explained that she was given the impression I was total oralist, who didn't know any sign language whatsoever. I explained to her that I was never encouraged to sign, but was able to pick up ASL from my parents and my friends at PSD. Emily shook her head, smiling. We laughed about the whole thing. We continued signing to each other and realized that for the first time in my career at GFS that I was having a lengthy, meaningful conversation with somebody. At the next class, Emily signed full speed ahead, and the entire class was mesmerized. Teacher? What teacher? Look at those beautiful hands. The beauty of ASL was there for all to see, graceful flowing hands relaying tons of information to a totally awed deaf student. There was certainly nothing to be embarrassed about as far as I was concerned. In fact, I was too much in awe of the information that Emily was relaying in sign language. Wonder of wonders, I found that my classmates were pretty cool people after all. I suddenly had access to their classroom discussion as well as their casual conversations and jokes. For the first time, I could understand everything that went on around me. I could appreciate everyone's input. You know how they say 2 minds are better than 1? Suddenly, I had access to 104 minds. It was a ton of information. How could I have gone wrong for so long while missing out on so much? My life had changed incredibly for the better after I got the interpreter. The same went for my teachers. Who knew that they could now treat me as an equal? The old, duh, I didn't know there was homework assignment excuse didn't work anymore. I was in on everything, and I benefited from it immediately. Not only was I expected to improve my work, I did, but I was also expected to be involved in the classroom discussion. I was, to an extent. Other students were able to develop a better understanding of who I was, now that they realized why I had appeared so lost, not to mention weird, in earlier times. Some of them were so impressed with sign language that they were inspired to learn some themselves. There were actually students who learned enough that they could hold a very basic conversation at ASL, although most just learned how to fingerspell. But whether it was signing words or fingerspelling to them, it meant a lot to me. It was great to see how other students were eager to understand my world. One student, Eric, helped other students become more sensitive to my needs. One day I was sitting in a small group of classmates in the cafeteria, and I was completely out of it. There was no way I could keep up with the conversation, as my interpreter was on break during the lunch period. Eric eventually joined us and sat at our table, and he noticed right away that I was not able to hold my own in this group discussion. At first, he briefly took the role of interpreter, summarizing the content of other students' dialogue. It didn't appeal to either of us, so we started having side conversation in ASL, as others continued to speak amongst themselves. At that moment, one of the students sitting next to Eric began to protest. Hey, he interrupted, it's not fair when you two sign like that. I can't understand what you're saying. Eric couldn't believe this. He shot back with an incredulous look. How do you think Mark feels 24 hours a day when he can't understand anything you and everyone else is saying? The object of Eric's wrath suddenly had a blank look on his face, and the reality of the situation hit him. Boom. Massive insight in progress. Holy shit, you're right. Soon afterwards, the student went out and learned sign language himself. So did a number of others at the table that day. It was a tremendous reality check for them. When my interpreter heard about it, what happened, she broke into a big grin. She knew that they were all learning something new. Before long, a number of students would be asking her for feedback on their signing skills. The whole thing was a blessing for me indeed. Although Emily did a fantastic job, it was not a long-term gig for her, and soon she moved out of town to pursue other opportunities. Another interpreter, Deborah, was hired for her place. Not only was Deb fluent in ASL, but she was also like a walking deaf encyclopedia. Anything there was to know about culturally deaf world, she knew it. It was strange, but there was this hearing person teaching me, a deaf guy, everything I wanted to know about ASL and deaf culture. We would talk about various deaf topics, and she would point out things that I had never had the time or maturity to realize on my own. In addition, I noticed that having an interpreter around would actually improve my own signing skills. I was consistently exposed to ASL every day, and I absorbed it like a sponge. I was learning more and more about myself and enjoying my education as well. Finally, after stumbling around the first couple of years, I genuinely enjoyed myself at GFS. Perhaps one of the funniest stories was the time that Mr. Gratwick, my 11th grade history teacher, kept me after class. History was my worst subject, and it was kind of awkward because Mr. Gratwick was also a varsity baseball coach. I dreaded him during the morning and loved him in the afternoon. One day, history class had just ended, and I made a beeline for the door. At the last second, Mr. Gratwick stepped up and asked if I could stay for a few minutes. Uh-oh. I knew I had bombed a recent assignment, and apparently it was time to face the music. I braced myself for an impromptu history lecture. Instead, to my surprise, this after-class meeting was about baseball. Mark, Mr. Gratwick began, I need to go over something that happened at yesterday's game. My eyes lit up. For baseball, I had all the time in the world. When you were at bat and Tommy was on third, I gave you the signal for a squeeze bunt. You missed it, and Tommy nearly got picked off. Are you sure you know how to the bunt sign? I acknowledged that I did, but in that situation, I must have been distracted or something. It was just a mental mistake on my part. Mr. Gratwick said it was all right, and he wanted to make sure that I knew the signals. And then he broke into a big grin. You, of all people, missing a sign. Now that I settled down at GFS, and enjoying school for a change, it was time to move on to other things that appeal to teenagers. I was ready to grow up and meet some girls and get a life. Thanks to my interpreter at school and a baseball game at home, getting a life was the easy part. I had a number of new friends at school who accepted me for who I was, and at home I grew closer to friends with whom I'd spent an entire summer playing baseball with. As for meeting girls, this was still a total bust. Yes, there were some girls who would say hello or even be platonic friends, but none of them wanted anything beyond that. I was still the deaf guy. A nice guy, reasonably fun to talk to, but not someone you would want to bring home to meet the parents. I'm not exactly sure what it was. Maybe none of the girls wanted to date a deaf guy because they preferred the popular jocks. Maybe some girls were actually intrigued, but unsure about how to interact with someone who was so different. Or maybe I was just a dork in general. Regardless of whether I was or not, I was deaf. Whatever it was, it affected my self-esteem. Everyone was dating. This person and that person were an item. Another couple was all but on the front page of National Enquirer, but not me. I scratched my head in bewilderment as I stayed home playing video games just about every weekend. What was wrong with me? In some ways, it was a blessing. Some days, when pigs flew and hell flew over, I would have a girlfriend. And when I did, I would appreciate it more. I was aware of some people who practically dated the entire phone book, and it was no big deal to them. I couldn't understand it. Are Tom and Sue still dating? No, they broke up. Sue's with Larry. I thought Larry was with Jennifer. They broke up last week. Jennifer's with Michael. I thought Michael was with Sharon. Sharon's with Tom. There is a tag team thing going on or what? I knew I wouldn't date girls as if they were the latest flavor of the month. I'd never take anyone for granted. Finally, one day, a pig flew by my window, and a girl named Karen asked me if I would accompany her to a junior prom. It caught me completely off guard. I had to ask her to repeat the question about 9 times to make sure it wasn't a cruel joke. Karen was not from GFS. I don't really know who she was. She asked me totally out of the blue. She was the friend of a girlfriend of a good friend of mine. She'd heard I was one of the most eligible bachelors in town. Further throwing me for a loop was the fact that prior to asking me to do this, she had practiced repeatedly until she could ask in sign language. Who was this girl? Why me? Why now? Why not? I said yes. I had been waiting for years for an opportunity like this. It was worth the wait. We had a great time at prom and kept seeing each other for a long time afterward. It turned out to be a powerful learning experience in more ways than one. Of course, my parents were elated that I finally had a girlfriend. My father was glad to know that I wasn't the eunuch that he thought I was. And my mother was absolutely thrilled that there was somebody out there who knew sign language. As long as Karen could sign, that was all that mattered. Unfortunately, the rest of my family was not as receptive. Karen was a fluent signer, yes, but she was also Catholic. Needless to say, they were not too thrilled that they let me know about it. All of this had me terribly confused. After years of being a total zero on the dating scene, I had finally found someone who not only wanted me on an intimate level, but they also knew sign language to boot. I was supposed to throw it all away just because she was Catholic? This made no sense. It reminded me of what I had learned while growing up with Siku. Why would anyone's race or religion make a difference in how we get along? Neither religion nor race mattered to me, but communication did. If you were willing to be my friend and accept me as a deaf person, I didn't care if you were white, black, Catholic, Jewish, Swahili, or whatever. It's simple. I really don't care who you are or where you come from. If you can if you can communicate, you're my friend. This is a great example of how I feel that being deaf has helped me grow as a person. I could appreciate my interaction with anyone and just be happy that we could get along. There was no point in getting bogged down on whatever groups or religions they belonged to. Human interaction is a blessing. It's such a waste to discriminate. As I came to terms with my hearing family's initial reaction to Karen's background, they eventually warmed up to her. I took advantage of the opportunity to find out what a big deal it was supposed to be. Out of curiosity, I began attending church with Karen. It was a brand new experience. My parents didn't really object, but they were concerned that it would greatly upset my mother's family. I agreed with them on this, so I never mentioned it to anyone other than my parents. Hey, it was my business. And I looked at it this way. If Karen could jump so deeply into my world of sign language, I could likewise jump into her world of Catholicism. Why not? We should learn all from each other. Both Judaism and Catholicism are unique religions, and I had an opportunity to learn about both. Hanukkah, Christmas, the whole shebang, it was all good, no big deal. After all, I had already celebrated Christmas on many occasions with my father's family. How could it hurt if I was invested with one more, and I had the best of both worlds? As it turned out, I enjoyed going to church, and I learned a lot from it. What really helped was the fact that Karen would discreetly interpret everything into sign language. I had access, and I was fascinated. I was not only struck by the differences between Catholicism and Judaism, but even more so by their similarities. There were common threads everywhere. I noticed this every week. It reinforced a sense that somehow we're all in this together. My only problem with religion then was the confusion after I felt seeing many people make a fuss over their religious differences. I never mentioned my church experiences to my Jewish family, for I had seen their reservations about me dating a Catholic girl. Likewise, I rarely talked about Jewish culture in the presence of Catholics, for I noticed a sense of anti-Semitism in certain individuals. Maybe it was just me, but I felt a distinctive sense of us versus them. Although most of the people and most of the experiences were overwhelmingly positive, there were always people on each side making derogatory comments about their faiths. Whenever this happened, I instinctively knew it was wrong. Both religions, in my opinion, are beautiful in their own right. I guess we all have an individual responsibility to learn tolerance and respect for each other. Until that happens, we all have a long way to go. Again, this is one of the reasons that I'm glad I'm deaf. Perhaps if I weren't deaf, I might have developed a bias favoring the first religion I was exposed to. Perhaps if I was hearing, the first morsel of religious dogma thrown my way might have been unconditionally accepted as absolute truth. But no, I was deaf. I grew up in a blank slate that had allowed me to see things from a more neutral perspective. In other words, being deaf emptied my cup, and I can see the religious differences simply as they are, without any bias. Karen and I had a long relationship, dating each other exclusively for about 3 years. 3 years. Normally, 3 years isn't much, but when those years are ages 16, 17, and 18, it's an eternity. In all honesty, 1 year probably would have been enough. Those kids who tag team dated the whole phone book, turns out they had the right idea after all. For Karen and me, it was a different story. Whereas other teen couples routinely broke up and found new people to go out with, I held on to Karen tightly. After all, she was the only girl in the whole neighborhood who signed. If we broke up, I knew it would take me years to find another language-accessible girlfriend. So I held on to her, through the good times and the bad times, sometimes the really bad. We could barely tolerate each other near the end of our relationship, yet at the same time, it was hard to let go. On top of that, I had a ridiculous level of insecurity that was not conducive to a healthy relationship. I always felt that hearing guys had much more to offer than I did, and I was afraid that sooner or later Karen would find out. Sure enough, Karen would inevitably be ready to go on her own way. But she also felt bad for me, and I could understand her mixed emotions. The end came after Karen enrolled in a local college. After years of being in an all-girls school, she was surrounded by other men for the first time in her life. They were hearing like her and shared similar interests in music and entertainment that I could not. In fact, Karen remarked frequently that she felt guilty whenever we went to movies because she knew she could never fully interpret the mood and the context that was taking place on the screen. Likewise, I would spend hours in movie theaters pretending I was enjoying the moment because I wanted her to be happy instead of feeling obligated to serve as my personal interpreter. Caption movies were still several years away. Not that that would have mattered. It was not fair to either of us. We knew it had to end, and we appropriately broke up. For Karen, it meant she was free at last. For me, it meant the same thing, although it was a tougher to deal with. I was worried that I would go back to being the deaf guy that no woman would ever want to be with. Breaking up with Karen would just be the tip of the iceberg. An awful lot of transitions were in store. The spring of 1984, I was a senior at GFS, and the graduation was right around the corner. Sadly, though, it was around this time when Grandpop was losing a tough battle against cancer. He was hospitalized in such bad shape that we weren't sure if he would last long enough to see me graduate. It had been his big dream that I would succeed at GFS, a dream that would soon become a reality. By late April, Grandpop was quickly running out of precious time. More than anything, I wanted him to know that a GFS diploma was in the bag. I approached him in his hospital room and informed him that not only was I going to graduate in June, but I also had been accepted into Temple University. For whatever reason, I also told him that I was going to be an accountant. I have no idea why I said that. I guess it seemed to be the right thing to do. Everyone else in my hearing family was a successful doctor, lawyer, accountant, or teacher, and I didn't want Grandpop to get the impression that I had no direction in life. I thought it would be the best to let him die happy, knowing that not only was I on track for the first deaf graduate of GFS, but I also had a prospective career in business. Finally, on May 4th, 1984, Grandpop passed away. The most spiritual person I ever known was gone. After a brief trip to the hospital with the family, I returned to GFS around noon, totally numb from the immeasurable loss. It was just too surreal, and I couldn't believe it. As shell-shocked as I was, there was still a baseball game to be played that day against Archbishop Ryan, one of the toughest teams on our schedule. I wasn't sure if I would play or not, but then again, I recalled how Grandpop had always been a familiar face at many of my games, and he was my biggest fan, always cheering me on. So that was settled that I was going to play this one for Grandpop. When the game rolled around, Archbishop jumped to a big lead with 2 innings. They were up 5-0 when Mr. Gratwick decided to pull out our starting pitcher and put me on the mound. This was clearly the strongest team we had played all year, and we were simply outmatched that day. Nonetheless, I pitched 5 innings, getting 7 strikeouts, while giving up only 2 earned runs. While I may have had better statistics in other games, I would say that was the best that I had ever pitched in my life, considering the circumstances and the talent level of the other team. We may have lost the game, but experience toughened us up for the stretch run. We steamrolled to an overall 19-4 record and won the Friends League championship a few weeks later, and shortly afterwards I had a diploma in my hand. This one's for you, Grandpop. It was hard getting used to life without Grandpop. He had been my biggest role model, and one of the few people I could really look up to. Granted, there was much he did not understand about the deaf world, but he made up for it in so many other ways. I considered myself blessed to have such a wonderful grandfather, and I realized that there was much that I had taken for granted. With that in mind, I decided that I would make the most of the time that I had left to spend with my surviving grandparents. Considering that my dad's mother, Nana, had moved from Scranton to an apartment nearby in Hatboro with her second husband, Mike Novak, I took advantage of the opportunity to visit them often. Most of the time, I would accompany my parents to visit Nana and Mike on some weekends and during holidays such as Christmas and Easter. After Grandpop died, I got into the habit of driving myself over just to say hello and shoot the breeze. I might have been a young adolescent, barely old enough to have a driver's license, but I was still able to notice significant differences in family dynamics when I interacted with my deaf grandparents. For instance, I was much more relaxed with them, and there was no pressure to act like a hearing person. There were no reminders that I needed to speak more clearly or wearing a hearing aid. With Nana and Mike, that was not necessary. They were deaf themselves. They understood. If I told them about the time I completely screwed up in class, they would acknowledge that it must have been hard for me. My hearing relatives usually told me that it was my responsibility to sit up front. If it was something amusing, such as the time that I said, "I don't know," to a substitute teacher who asked me what my name was, Nana and Mike laughed along with me. I appreciated this, although there were many situations where there was nothing more that we could do but laugh at ourselves. This was no laughing matter to my hearing family. Worrying about me to a fault, they would react with grave concern and repeatedly point out that it was my responsibility to adjust to the hearing world. With Nana and Mike, in contrast, being deaf was looked at as something we were, not something that needed to be fixed. Consequently, I never felt like I needed to win their approval. Nana and Mike didn't care if I wore a hearing aid. They didn't care if I could speak clearly or not. They didn't worry incessantly about things that were out of our control. There was no, you should know this, or you should do that. Whoever I was at the moment in the time was just fine with them. The important thing was that I was doing okay in whatever way that I could. Another benefit of having deaf family members was that with them there was no dinner table syndrome, where the deaf person sits completely lost amongst hearing family members, having a table conversation. So it was not uncommon for me to stay for an amount of time that would have been unbearable with hearing people. Time flew quickly because everyone was fully involved in whatever was going on. One evening in 1985, I paid a visit to my deaf grandparents and enjoyed a lengthy stay. Around 10 p.m., it was time to go, so I said goodbye and headed out to the parking lot. As I pulled out of my parking space, I looked up and I could see Nana standing by the window of the eighth floor lobby. There was something surreal about it, and it froze me in my tracks. I could see only her silhouette 8 stories up, but it seemed like time had slowed down, as her hand gently waved goodbye, and I waved back and found myself overcome with emotion. For whatever reason, I was choked up. I really believe that somehow Nana and I instinctively knew that this was the last time things would be this way. Call me weird, but sometimes it seems like life is one big stage, and we're all actors following a script. It was like subconsciously, Nana I knew what was next. Nana never walked to the lobby and waved from that window before. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I was overwhelmed with a sense of imminent change. The following day I had my answer. The phone rang, and it was a relative calling to inform us that Nana had suffered a nasty stroke. She would never be the same again. Visiting her in the hospital, my family and I discovered that she was unable to walk and unable to use her right hand, had lost her ability to read, and was confusing various relatives' names. She referred to my dad as Robert and Uncle Bob as Charlie. She was in for a long period of rehabilitation. As often as I could, I visited Nana in the hospital. Perhaps I felt guilty because when Grandpop had been terminally ill, I was not always there for him. It was impossible for me to be involved as much as I would have liked. Family members shielded me from the grim nature of his terminal illness for as long as possible, and even after it became obvious, there were people telling me what to say or do. Now that this was Nana who was sick, I was saying the things that came from my heart. Perhaps I was more mature this time around, or perhaps more comfortable with the presence of deaf relatives. We openly shared stories with Nana, and we discussed her progress with the doctors. With Grandpop, I was often in the dark as far as what the doctors and relatives said. Sometimes I felt like a burden, for it was hard enough for the hearing family to deal with Grandpop's illness without having to slowly repeat the dismal news to me. With Nana, however, most of us were deaf, so we were all on the same page and shared the medical prognosis together. We had the whole story, which was, in fact, that she had quite an uphill battle to fight. Slowly, Nana began making progress so that she could be discharged from the hospital. But before returning home, she would have to spend some time in a rehabilitation center, and turned out that the Hopkins House in Jenkintown. This was a fine facility, and Nana did indeed make progress. She regained her ability to walk, although she would still need to spend much of her time in a wheelchair. Everything else came along slowly. Her right hand was still curled up and unable to function normally. She complained that she could no longer read books or follow the captions on TV. Interestingly, her signing skill remained intact, although she was limited to signing with one hand. Shortly after returning home, Nana had yet another setback. She collapsed from a second stroke, and Mike was barely able to assist her in time to save her life. After yet another hospital stay, it was determined that Nana would need to live in a place where she could have round-the-clock medical supervision. Grudgingly, she and Mike accepted the family's strong recommendation that they move to the Neville Home, a nursing home for the deaf in Media, Pennsylvania. Of course, no couples likes to leave their freedom of their own place to live in, of all places, a nursing home. Nana might have lost some function, but her wits were still intact. "Put me out to pasture, eh? Why don't you take me out behind the barn and shoot me?" It wasn't long before Nana and Mike were settled down and having a great time. There were nightly events featuring movies, games, and occasional trips, such as an excursion to Atlantic City. The other residents were deaf, and most of the staff signed, so Nana and Mike were socializing a whole lot more than they ever did in their old apartment complex. Gradually, Nana regained the old spark that we hadn't seen in her for a long time. She started hurling friendly insults at Mike, and even threw a Kleenex box at him whenever he dozed off in front of the TV. When she started making fun of other people and cracking one-liners, a la the Sophia character on Golden Girls, that's when we knew she was on her way back. This part of the book is a huge reason why we now have the 5th edition. In earlier editions, I surmise that perhaps Nana's increased use of sign language in the Neville home stimulated different parts of her brain to kickstart her recovery. In an old article in Time magazine suggested as much. Several years later, Dr. Laura Ann Petito, her groundbreaking research under the National Science Foundation and Gallaudet University's Science of Learning Center, Visual Language and Visual Learning, Volume 2, revealed something far more fascinating. Brain scans have shown that sign language is processed in the same brain tissue that scientists initially thought processed only speech. As Dr. Petito is quoted saying, "The more language exposure, the better. The brain does not discriminate. It accepts both sound and sign. This is significant on many levels. It smashes to smithereens the oralist myth of the past. We now know that the use of sign language does not interfere with a child's ability to learn English or to learn how to speak. In fact, it enhances it." And getting back to Nana, her signing did not trigger different parts of her brain, nor was there a left brain, right brain dynamic going on, something I also wondered about since Nana began signing more with her left hand after her strokes. And reviewing all of the possible explanations, I believe I finally figured it out. Nana was freaking happy to be around other deaf people. It turned into a big party at Neville home. It even reached the point where our family smuggled in beer and whiskey for Mike. It wasn't permitted. But so what? These were the twilight years. Why shouldn't they enjoy every minute of it? Although Nana would never be exactly the same as she was before the strokes, the progress she made at the Neville home was amazing. I couldn't help but notice at Hopkins House, she was surrounded by the most professional, competent staff of physical therapists you could ever ask for. Yet her heart wasn't really in it. She made enough progress to go home, but just barely. At Neville home, Nana clearly enjoyed life again. Her spirits rose high enough to the point where she was able to bounce back considerably. I really believe that having deaf friends and family and ASL competent staff around gave Nana the emotional boost that enabled her to regain much of what she had lost. It wasn't long before she once again was able to read and do her favorite crossword puzzles. Yes, she still had to spend much time in her wheelchair, and she also struggled with her short-term memory, but nonetheless, she had come a long way. It was a remarkable comeback. The bottom line was, once again, she was enjoying a quality of life that she hadn't experienced since her days as a cook in the local deaf club. If you stop to think about it, you'll notice a parallel here. Often, deaf advocates argue that deaf children deserve the quality of life that is available to them when you allow them to interact with their deaf peers. In this case, with Nana and Mike, I discovered that it was a universal truth that applied to all ages. Ironically, I had yet to realize this truth applied to me as well. The Neville home allowed them to rediscover that missing spark, a spark that gave them the strength to recover physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Nana and Mike would spend the next 7 years at Neville home, where family would get together and celebrate Christmas and other joyous occasions on a regular basis. When they both eventually passed away within months of each other, Nana in the fall of 1991 and Mike in the spring of 1992, we had accumulated many wonderful memories, and I considered myself blessed to have had such wonderful grandparents on both sides of the family.